Hopefully you've done your reading and maybe watched a short video on capitalism and Adam Smith and the evolution of economic thought into the idea that people, when set free to work on their own, will be very productive. They'll be motivated by their quest for money, their greed, and they will work hard to produce goods they can sell to others, and that will make them very productive. This idea of capitalism, as it spread during the Industrial Revolution in particular, of course led a lot of people to very productive efforts, to a lot of creativity and new inventions, to changes in technology that allowed a nation to become more productive. I'm thinking of England particularly right now. And if you looked at just the macrocosm, the measurements, gross domestic product of England at the time, absolutely growing, producing more and more and more, highly productive nation. And the folks that supported capitalism would say, "Hoorah, see, look at that. Look how well off we are. Look how powerful our nation is becoming." But when you took a little closer view, you took a more microeconomic view at the situation to see what was going on, engendering all that increase in productivity, you found some pretty disturbing things. You found factories that were constructed that were very unsafe, very uncomfortable. You found workers working long hours, 12-hour, 14-hour days. You found them working 6 and a half, even 7-day weeks. You found children, even as young as the age of 6, employed working in factories. You found the abuse of workers by the owners of the factories. Why? To make more profit. If you could hire a worker and keep his wages very low and keep your price up, you could make more profit. And the lower you could force his wages, the more profit you could make. And so the owners of many businesses, not all, but many, saw that and basically viewed their workers as simply another component of production, just like another piece of equipment. You hire this person, you put him on the job, you teach him the specialized work he does because it's now assembly line production, and he works 10 hours or 12 hours a day, and if he breaks his arm, if he gets sick, whatever, you throw him out and you find a new person to put in there. And so the idea of a safe working place, or the idea of a minimum wage, the term minimum wage would have just sent owners into paroxysms of laughter. A minimum wage? Yeah, I'm going to pay him a minimum wage. I'm going to pay him the minimum wage I possibly can. Why would I pay him more? And remember, I'm the owner. I'm taking all the risks of running this business. I could lose everything I own. And so the owners could justify to themselves the fact that since they were the engineers making this happen, that they deserve the profits of the business. And the people ought to just be damn grateful they've got a job, because a lot of them, by the way, didn't have jobs. They were barely subsisting out there on the farm. So here's capitalism growing along with this ugly side to it, this working environment. And over time it becomes generational. Generation after generation of workers working in the same factories, in the same mines, for the same employers, and seeing no hope for their children to see a brighter future. This is what we do. Well, you let that go on long enough, you get a lot of unhappy workers. If you read carefully English history through the 1600s and 1700s, there were a number of revolts or battles between groups of English workers protesting against their owners for working them too hard or cutting their pay, and on and on. Which this little bubbling cauldron of dissatisfied and, if you will, abused workers finally begins to coalesce, begins to take shape, when it's given voice by a man that most of us in Western civilizations hear his name and we think, oh, bad guy, but a guy named Karl Marx. Karl Marx, kind of the father of communism, if you like. Karl Marx sees what's going on in these factories, these mines, and after thinking on it for quite a while, in 1848, he writes a little document. It's actually not very long. It's called the Communist Manifesto. And the first line of the Communist Manifesto says this. It says, "Workers of the world, excuse me, that's the wrong line. That's the closing line. The opening line says, there is a specter haunting Europe. What is a specter? A specter is a ghost. And Marx is saying there is a spirit or ghost haunting Europe that's going to condemn you and your family to a life of poverty and miserable existence for generation after generation after generation. What is that specter? And that specter, in Marx's eyes, was capitalism. This economic system evolving into a social system where you have the wealthy and the workers, the owners of the factories and the workers. And a system there that would perpetuate itself forever if the workers didn't take matters into their own hands and do something about it. Marx explains his rationale a little more when he talks about the labor theory of value. Labor theory of value. Value comes from labor. We want to explore that in just a minute. But Marx is really caught up in the idea that you, the worker, have got to do something to better your situation because your employer, the owner of the business, isn't going to do anything about it. Two terms that he uses we want to be familiar with. He talks about the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie were the capitalists, okay? The capitalists were the owners of capital, the owners of the factories, of the means of production, of the mines. And he says you have the bourgeoisie, and they are opposed by their workers. His big theme is, what are we going to do about the bourgeoisie? Because we, and he speaks for this crowd, the workers, we are the proletariat. We are the workers. And so he casts his battle in these two terms, the proletariat against the bourgeoisie. And he says, don't look for these people to voluntarily improve your living. Don't look for them to improve your income or your lifestyle or the safety of the working conditions or to provide you with better homes. Don't look for that. Ain't happening. He says there's only one way to get out of the situation that you're in. And he says this is the way it will always work. You will go from capitalism, which involves worker exploitation, okay? Where your owner, your business owner, your manager, your boss is exploiting you. More on that in a minute. And what must happen next to improve your lot, to improve your world, and remember, workers, you are the majority. What you have to have next is, and I use the word intentionally, violent revolution. That you must take over the factories. You must throw the owners out, and you must do it by force because they're not going to go gently. And when this was tried on small scale in small groups in distant places around England at the time, the government would show up or the owner would hire private hooligans, thugs, who would come out and literally bust people up and even kill them for these sorts of revolts. So Marx says, you got to do this, everybody at the same time. Revolt against the owners, workers everywhere, take over the factories and do it by force because force will be used against you. And once you have taken over the means of production, you will then go through this transitionary stage, be careful here, called socialism. All right? You will go through this stage called socialism where you will be educated and learn how we can do better than capitalism. How we can all cooperatively engage our efforts, raise our productivity, and improve our lifestyles. Because we will all be working together. And as we learn to do that, as we learn how much we can work together, we will eventually evolve into this system of communism. And under communism, we won't need a government. We'll all be cooperative individuals calling each other comrade and everybody working hard. Here was a saying under this beautiful world. From each according to his ability. That is, do what you're able, work as hard as you can to contribute to society. And to each according to his need. That is, we will give to you from our product, from our GDP, we will give you what you need. Just ask for what you need, and implicit in that, don't ask for more than what you need. Think about that. Imagine coming up to the pay window and I say, well, hello, Joe. It's payday. How much money do you need? What would you say? If you really do, yeah, you can get by with about $400. Would you tell me $400? Is that human nature? I got another one for you. You're standing in the pay line, and I'm going to ask you how much money you need, and right behind you comes this other guy, Strickland, and you've watched him for the whole week, and he hadn't lifted a finger. He hadn't done a bit of work. And as you're walking away, Strickland walks up to the pay window and says, I need $500, and I give it to him. And you see him getting well paid for doing nothing. What are you going to be thinking next week when you come to work? Are you going to really want to work hard? Why should you? You can just goof off like Strickland and still get a paycheck. There were some real problems in Mr. Marx's idea of wonderful cooperation, but no matter, we never got there anyway. What we saw was the development of socialism, particularly in Eastern Europe after World War II. And this was a system that entailed a huge role for government, large government. Now, government's role expanded after World War II, particularly after the Great Depression, as we saw economic systems that seemed to improve living circumstances by giving government a greater role. In the United States in the 1950s, Dwight Eisenhower built basically the interstate road system in the United States, which has been very, very useful in improving our productivity, but that was a huge role for government to take on. We saw this huge role for government in World War II. They built the tanks, planes, etc. that fought the war. And as things evolved, we began to accept that maybe Smith's idea of government was too narrow, and government could and should do this or do that, or take on this problem or solve that problem or provide funding for this. Okay? So we saw the growth of government. But Marx saw government basically replacing the capitalistic idea of productivity. At any rate, Marx, in his socialism approach, with this large role of government, provided a system as it developed through the 50s and 60s and 70s, particularly in the USSR, former Russia, or Russia's former persona, which was the incorporation of the Soviet republics. What we saw was that economic system, for the reasons we just talked about at the pay window, it didn't work worth a damn. It was not very productive. It was full of corruption. Okay? So this experiment in huge degrees of socialism by Russia and others, including China, proved not to work very well. It proved not to work very well by the 1990s. But it has a name, an image, a persona now associated with the word socialism in a lot of Americans' minds to mean communism. But they're not the same thing. Socialism is a spectrum. You can have a little of it, you can have a lot of it. It's a spectrum of how much role do you want government playing in your lives, in your economy. Do you think, for example, government should provide for public education? And if your answer is yes, well, maybe you are to a degree a socialist. Okay? Do you think that the government should provide for health care? Do you think that the government should provide for daycare? Do you think that the government should give you time off for 6 months after you have a baby, with pay? I mean, to what extent do you think that government, and read taxpayer, should be paying for those things? That's not an easy answer, okay? Socialism is in degrees. America today is somewhat socialist, okay? But more socialist, you go over to England, you go over to France, particularly you go to the Scandinavian countries, they're more socialist. Their government does more, and it does it, by the way, by collecting large taxes. But if you look at the standards of living in some of those countries, particularly in Scandinavia, you see very high standards of living. But you also see very high tax rates. And the ethic in America has always been, keep the government out of my life, I don't want to have to pay too much taxes. So there is no, I think, no clear wrong or right. It's what's right for you and your society. And that's why we have political systems. All right? One quick last note, the labor theory of value, worker exploitation. Marx said, look, here's your problem as a worker. The boss pays you $10 to make a pair of shoes, and then he turns around and sells it for $50. Do you understand? You created $50 worth of shoes. It's your labor that created that value. That's the labor theory of value. And when he sells it for $50 and only pays you $10, he is taking $40 away from you. $40 in value that you created and he's keeping. Now, how many workers would you have to talk to down at the bar after work and paint that story to them before they were going, oh yeah, right on, buy him another beer? It's not hard to get workers excited when you start presenting things to them in those ways. So Marx was successful in his way, and we saw the revolution, if you will, the 1917 revolution in Russia, which was clearly a revolution, but we saw the advent of more worker controls, more worker say-so in Europe, and the workers' unions became very powerful. And in the United States, early 1900s on up, we saw unions growing. We saw workers coalescing. They didn't go to violent revolution in the United States, although there were a number of incidents of violence and deaths. But for the most part, we saw the rise of collective bargaining. That is, we allowed the unions to form and bargain with their employers. And with the growth of the unions through the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, even up in the 60s, unions became powerful, and they had quite an influence on legislation, and they led us to some good things, like minimum wage, safe working conditions, etc. They also, like usual, they went a little bit too far, and they began to outprice themselves. They began to demand such high wages that American companies could no longer compete in the world. Take a look at the collapse of the American steel industry in the 1970s. You can see an example of that. So the pendulum swings, okay? Sometimes in favor of capitalism, sometimes more in favor of the workers and socialism, and back and forth and back and forth. Hopefully we stay away from the extremes of either. All right, that's a little view on Marx and his criticism of capitalism, and some terminology I hope that stays with you. Bye.